fascinating, dynamic, and sometimes enraging conversation. Right now, I am also proud to serve on the board of the Bay Area Book Festival, so I'm extremely grateful to each and every one of you who has come out to join us today, both for this conversation and for all the other amazing programs that are being offered. I have three fabulous authors here with me today. I have Emile Suotonye DeWeaver, and I have Dorsey Nunn, sitting directly to my left, and Gianna Toboni. And we're going to get into them and their wonderful books. And this program, by the way, is Ghosts of Justice, Exposing the Failures and Reimagining the Future of the American Legal System. And with no further ado, we're going to get right into it. So I think rather than read people's bios, which is always a little dry, I really like to just take advantage of the time that we have together and get right to it by letting people sort of introduce themselves. But I'm just going to pose a question to each person so that they can let you know exactly who they are. So, hey Dorsey. Dorsey I've known for some years. You got that on? Tap, tap. Is it on? All right. We may need a little assistance with a mic. Oh, I think it went on.
I think it just went on.
Super. No, it just went on. All right. Dorsey and I have known each other for quite a minute because I was released from prison in 2005. And when I came out of prison, I was sort of like, wow, I'm not sure what just happened, but it certainly wasn't justice. And as I began to try to cast about and better inform myself about what people were doing in this country to oppose mass incarceration, one of the organizations and efforts that I immediately came upon was All of Us or None, which Dorsey helped co-found. And he also led legal services for prisoners with children, which was something I was particularly concerned about, not because I was a mother yet, but because I had been incarcerated in a women's prison, where the plight of families is really front and center.
How many children now?
One.
Sorry.
That's all right. But I'm just saying all this to let you know that Dorsey is true OG and really one of the contemporary leaders of the opposition to mass incarceration. And I was so thrilled. There are pictures in this book. I love a book with pictures. And they are from like 2003, 2005, because Dorsey, one of the first successful campaigns that Dorsey helped to conceive and lead, was banning the box, which, yeah, if you want to know where ban the box originated, the person who can tell you is right on this stage. Here's the thing, Dorsey. I'm talking, I want to hear from you. Why did you make us wait so long for this memoir? This is the memoir we have been waiting for. I feel like your life maps this entire contemporary period of mass incarceration, which has all happened within my lifetime. Tell me what finally brought you to tell your story.
What brought me to tell my story? I'm in 5 or 6 other books that I didn't write. So I figured like it was time for me to actually tell my story. At first I was saying I just want to tell my story, but I got a quote in here from Malik Rahim. And I think that his quote sums up, because he was an old Southern Panther. And he said in his book, to the most part, what he talked about that I got, and I had already wrote my book, but I thought it symbolized what it said. He says that when an elder make a transition and don't convey his life experiences, a library has just been burned. And I thought that captured it exactly, because I've been in this full-fledged struggle. I haven't had a real, I guess it is a real job, but my whole existence been from 1981 till now, fighting for the full restoration of civil and human rights. And I've touched you in ways that you don't even know I touched you. So it's like when y'all talk about the prison industrial complex, That was me and Angela Davis and a whole bunch of other people that actually took an obscure term out of Mike Davis' book and introduced it to you. When you talk about voting rights for incarcerated people, how come I wrote the book? I wrote the book is because the most important thing that happened to me when I was in prison, I learned how to read. And absent learning how to read, I probably would still be back in prison. So like I wrote the book because some people in prison need to get books that they can read, that they can actually see themselves in. So for every 4 books that I sell, I donate 1 to a prisoner. You know, so I'm not making any money off of this shit. What I'm doing is lifting consciousness because I need more people to come home that's conscious, that can produce the kind of change that I want to see. Beautiful.
This book is an epic personal journey that will teach you everything I think you need to know about the history of mass incarceration in this country. So, Emile, Ghost in the Criminal Justice Machine is also a really deeply, deeply personal book, but it is a wildly different book. It's a different take, and it's also a different modality in terms of approaching a personal story. So I'm very curious how you decided, and perhaps discovered, the way that you wanted to depict and dissect the criminal legal system.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Like, one experience, but I've been a story. Hello. Thank you. Hello. I've been a storyteller like most of my life, and you know, the merging of storytelling and narratives around like social justice or like moving or shifting culture or challenging ideologies actually came to me while I was in prison, and Brian Stevenson came and he gave this talk and started talking about like proximity. And he tells all these stories about proximity, and if you're familiar with his work, like you know like how like impactful they are and how mind-blowing they are. And I'm sitting in the audience thinking to myself, like I'm in this work trying to like educate a public about like what's really going on in prisons and educate a public about like what's really going on with me, but this public has been raised to fear me. And so like how do I get proximate with like that kind of population? And I spent a lot of time thinking about it. And I came to realize, it's like, oh wait, like you're already doing that. Like, cause you know, I'd had dozens and dozens of encounters with editors whose whole like worldview was shifted just from knowing me and working with me. And like a common refrain was like, you know, you've changed the way that I see incarcerated people, not just you, but like all incarcerated people. One of my editors is like a German conservative, and like, you know, he wrote a letter of support when I applied for a commutation, and what he said to the governor is like, I have not been, in essence, like, I feel like I've been lied to about who's in prison and what's happening in prison. And I know Emile, but if there are other people in prison like Emile, then I think we need to be doing something else, something besides what we're doing. And so for me, that like signaled for me, it reinforced like the power of stories. So like the book I wrote because I'm a strategist, and I have seen all of the ways that we lose and we win, and I think that I have like some very important frameworks to offer about why we're losing and how to do better at winning. And so what I have to say is, for many people, going to be very hard to digest. And I, in fact, spent 10 years thinking about writing this book before I ever like put a pen to the page and started writing any words. But by that time, I knew that the only way that this was going to be successful is for me to leverage the power of story, particularly my story, and for me to do it honestly and vulnerably, to like buy the trust of the reader to understand that like they can rely on what I'm saying at least enough to explore it for themselves.
Yeah, I think that question of trust is something that all incarcerated or formerly incarcerated writers and storytellers think about a lot. So much. Thanks for this really remarkable book, very unique to me. Gianna, so my son and I were watching John Oliver recently, and I was like, wait a minute. There's a clip of a woman interviewing, you know, a Trump acolyte, basically, someone involved in overturning Roe v. Wade. And I was like, wait a minute, I'm reading this woman's book right now. So I was very excited by that, and sort of braggy to my son. But you're a reporter, you're a journalist, and you work on a wide-ranging, you know, array of topics. So I'm curious to hear what brought you to Scott Dozier's story, which is told in your book, The Volunteer, and what also, given that we all up here know, you know, what it takes out of you to write a book. Like I mean, it's hard to do a fast, you know, TV clip, but a book takes a lot of very different demand from the author. What explains your decision to dig into the death penalty in so much detail via a book?
I originally came across Scott Dozier's story while working on a program called Vice on HBO. It was a documentary program. We were on season 6 of the show, and I turned to my co-producer and just sort of said, how have we never covered the death penalty? You know, we had covered mass incarceration, we had done a lot of reporting with incarcerated folks, but we had never touched the death penalty, and it was just kind of surprising to me, and so I felt that HBO was about to can our show, and so I said, let's do it. You know, this is our last season, we gotta cover this. And HBO said, under one condition, you have to get an interview with somebody on death row, and the person has to be on camera, which is hard to do in a lot of states. They have sort of arbitrary policies that, you know, I think in a lot of cases, you know, are designed in order to keep media out of death row. And so I had an idea of, you know, the person I wanted to interview, and I had, you know, was working with various organizations, including the Innocence Project, and we finally got to a point where we weren't going to be able to choose the person. We were going to have to get an interview with someone we could get an interview with. And that ended up being this guy, Scott Dozier. You know, at the beginning, I would describe him as completely unsympathetic. He had a privileged childhood. He was from the American West. You know, as someone said the other day, you know, like, what was this guy's excuse? Like, he really was given everything in life, and it's a very long story that unfolds in the book. But, you know, he landed on death row in Nevada, and I was originally interested in his story because he was sentenced to death and volunteered for execution. He told the state, you know, let's get this over with. I don't want to live in this solitary cell for another 40 years. And the state couldn't find a way to kill him. So anyway, the story kind of, that's sort of the beginning. It goes from there. But the reason that I would say I chose, as you said, I've, you know, covered cartels and ISIS fighters and, you know, trans kids and the political attacks against them. And the reason that I decided to dive into this book is because I got to know this guy very well. And in the last couple months of his life, you know, I felt that he was being tortured by the state. I felt that the sort of, you know, who was originally described as the sort of bad guy in this case went from Scott Dozier to the state. I really saw the state as the criminals in you know, this kind of duel. And I wanted to know, I knew from Scott Dozier's side what happened to him and how he died, but I wanted the state side of the story. And so I felt that I needed to have the time and the space, which a book would allow, in order to do all of the FOIA requests, the Freedom of Information Act requests, to get all of the prison emails, to get the warden's text messages, to get all the medical records of Scott Dozier when he was in prison in his last couple months. I wanted to know what exactly they were doing to him. And I felt like a book was the only way I'd be able to figure it out.
Amazing. So, hopefully everyone in the room knows that the US incarcerates more of our own people than any society in human history has ever done. That policy of mass incarceration is relatively recent, like I'm 55, it's happened within my lifetime, but that the US has a long history of harsh punishment that sort of grows out of the economic and cultural systems of colonialism and of chattel slavery specifically. Like, those systems wouldn't have functioned without harsh punishment of many different kinds. The largest execution the largest state execution in U.S. history was ordered by Lincoln, the great emancipator, when he ordered 38 Dakota people to be murdered by the federal government in Minnesota. When we look at the way that the criminal justice system operates, this question is from you. How do you think these values and practices appear even in things that are couched as reforms or even as rehabilitation? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Like, how are these kind of punishment values like encoded in aspects of the system that we might not otherwise feel like they live in? I think, yeah, the rehabilitation is like a really good example of that, right? Because rehabilitation seems good. It's like, who would argue against like giving people education, giving them skills, like giving them like, we weren't getting therapy, but like it's just like the layman's way of saying the thing, like peer support therapy, like how are those bad things? And I like to compare it to like missionary work, right? Like, you think that like, oh, what's wrong with feeding a village? It's like, yeah, there's nothing wrong with feeding a village, but like that's not all that's going on, right? There's like also the wholesale wiping out of like indigenous cultures in exchange for feeding the village is also the fact that like, the people sending the missionaries are the reason why the village is starving. And so rehabilitation has like this similar dynamic where like good things are going on, but it's still a part of this very like insidious, punitive practice of like demeaning and degrading incarcerated people, and in many cases reprogramming them to like be supporters of like the state and perpetuators of white supremacy. And the place where that really hit home for me is like standing in like, or sitting in a rehabilitation group, and it's like, all these leaders in rehabilitation whom I admire, and like I was one of these leaders, I was once drinking the Kool-Aid. But like, what I came to realize as I was sitting there and I was listening to the way that we talked about ourselves is I was just like, oh my God, we hate ourselves. Like the way, like there's always like, I'm horrible, I don't deserve anything, I should be here. And this practice of self-abnegation that is like laced through rehabilitation. Like, my entire life for a long time was just devotion to like the people I had harmed in my community, like my prison slave labor. I would put my prison slave wage, like I would donate it to charity, like even though I didn't have toothpaste in my cell, right? So it's like this deep abnegation, this deep self-hatred that's an essence of plea to society, like please forgive me. Please, like, acknowledge me as a human being. And the reality of that is like, there is no sustainable healing, there is no sustainable change that can rest on self-hatred. So people get out of prison, but they hate themselves, and then they come back to prison, right? And then it's like, well, that's because they need more rehabilitation. But rehabilitation is what's causing it, and whereas the regular criminal justice system is about like, the state punishing the individuals, what rehabilitation becomes about is teaching the individual to punish themselves.
Yeah? Do you have a mic that works?
I hear you. Suppose I'm rehabilitated and all these other people aren't. Fundamentally. I believe, like, my introduction to prison happened long before I got to prison. My introduction to prison happened when I was about 5 years old and people were burning shit on my yard. My introduction, excuse me, I cussed a lot.
In Menlo Park.
In Menlo Park. I learned to read and I found out about blockbusting, redlining, and white flight. I bought a couple of exhibits, that young Mike can look at. That's when he was burning stuff on my homie's yard when we was in kindergarten. I got my homegirl bought a house 2 weeks ago, and she found the documents in Richmond that laid out the covenant. Have y'all ever read one of these things? If y'all haven't read one of these things, what it says is that a person couldn't sell or transfer properties unless the was 100% Caucasian. So I've been thinking probably since I got this, like, who in the hell is these Caucasian people? You know, like, how's it defined? You know, because they definitely define black people and brown people, but they didn't define it. The other question is, you know, like, what happens when people talk to me about, I'm gonna give you a second chance? I mean, you know, I feel like, what I'm supposed to do, kiss your ass and say omnipotent one? What happened when I write a letter to the victims of my crime? I don't think I owe the state shit. Excuse me, my daddy taught me how to cuss. Because he was a frustrated person that had been redlined. And I wrote the letter, and then I brought somebody out from New York to help me write the letter, because I didn't want to offend. But I wasn't sitting there thinking that I owed the state anything. I definitely had participated in a serious crime where somebody died. And I thought I needed to give an apology to the family. But for the first 11 years that I served, they told me never to contact the victim. So this stuff about, you know, victim rights and stuff like that, this is some new shit. They used to tell us don't get in contact with anybody, even though we was having the experience of something. But, you know, like, I just want to change it. The term is like, how about giving us a fair opportunity than a fucking chance? That's, you know, that's the language that I need to address. And by the way, the most difficult thing for me to do to write the book was I wasn't going to code switch for somebody else's convenience.
That's right. Thanks for your leadership, your authentic leadership for such a long, many decades. This question of sort of abnegation of the self, abnegation of sort of the humanity of a person, and the state actor, right? The state acting as the implementer of punishment and justice is obviously extremely clear when you look at the death penalty. So I'm curious, Gianna, when we think about the contemporary death penalty, how all these factors kind of start showing up and what enables sort of the perpetuation of state murder.
So I think it has a lot to do with how people benefit politically. So you have a ton of prosecutors. I'll just actually start with a data point, which is that 49.9% of death sentences are overturned in this country. So that says a lot about how weak these cases are to begin with. And so you might ask, you know, how are they weak? Do we just have bad law schools here? No, of course. It's because district attorneys, prosecutors benefit politically from racking up death sentences in certain counties in this country. And when you look at where the death sentences are, they're in, you know, a few counties. You can see that, you know, much higher rates in specific counties, and that's because those district attorneys are out there campaigning on this promise to, you know, sentence people to death. And it becomes a sort of political charade beyond that when the state, including in places where these counties are, doesn't find that it's politically advantageous to actually do the executions. So effectively what's being done is prosecutors are sentencing a ton of people to death, and then in certain states, those folks are essentially just getting life without parole sentences. There's never an intention to actually go through with the executions. So it's this sort of kind of political game that's being played throughout our country. I mean, that's one example of, you know, I think, you know, how people are benefiting from this. But of course we could get into the sort of black markets and, you know, how in other states, you know, officials are trying so hard to execute people that they are actually when they can't get access to execution drugs because a lot of these drug companies, they don't want to sell their drugs for execution for obvious reasons. The states don't stop though. They continue to try to buy them illegally, fraudulently. They'll go overseas to small towns in India and illegally buy drugs, illegally import them, and then execute people here with drugs that are not FDA approved and have had zero oversight by our government. In other cases, you'll have prison officials who meet in parking lots, including, by the way, from San Quentin, back when we had the death penalty. And they'll do a sort of a drug deal, effectively, in a parking lot in front of the prison in order to get access to drugs in order to carry out these executions. It's, of course, there's, this is all riddled with irony, that you have officials who are consistently breaking the law in order to abide by the law, in order to carry out these executions. But for anyone who thinks that the system is being carried out in any kind of ethical way, I think the very existence of state-sanctioned murder is completely and totally unethical. It needs to do kind of very little research to find out that it's completely unlawful the way this is continues to kind of be carried out in our country.
And when we talk about that political benefit, so we can easily conceptualize, winning a local district attorney's race. But when we think about, the death penalty is also deeply, deeply racist, right? People are vastly more likely to be sentenced to death if they are not white than white people. How does that play out most concretely in terms of like which structures on the ground or local, either at the local level or the national level, are supported by the death penalty?
So you'll find racism at every level of the system, from when someone is arrested to defense attorneys, which surprises a lot of people. But yeah, at every level you'll see that racism. And then, sorry, I didn't understand the last part of your question.
Sort of the maintenance of the death penalty in some polities versus others. I'm from Massachusetts, where I'm not sure if we ever had the death penalty, but they did away with it long ago. However, the power structure in Massachusetts is not much threatened by communities of color, as opposed to, let's say, what states are most prevalent in terms of their commitment to the death penalty.
Sure, I mean, it's, this may come as no surprise, but of course it's a lot of the red states, a lot of the states where you see folks who, are blatantly racist in trial, for instance. You'll see juries, prosecutors, lawyers who, will say things to them that they might say, oh, that's not, I don't have any racial bias, but you're watching this thing unfold and you're saying, this person doesn't understand the first thing about what they've just said out loud. So yes, it's in a lot of the red states, and the states where you see, racism playing out more blatantly, I would say, more on the surface than you do in other places. But I also want to mention that, on the point of race, back in the late 80s, I won't go into the long story of the Supreme Court case that produced this study, but long story short, there was a study that showed that black men who killed white victims were 17 times more likely to be given the death sentence. So that's the sentencing phase. Years later, in 2020, so we're talking 2030, more than 30 years later, I think people would have thought that society would have progressed and that data would have improved. And in fact, the opposite happened. There were two researchers that started to study how that data changed when the executions came along. So in the late 80s, they were studying the sentences by the time folks were actually executed, and they found that our racial biases had actually gotten worse. And so a black man who was convicted of killing a white victim was actually 20 times more likely to be executed. So what that means between the sentencing phase and the execution phase, biases got worse. So there are a lot of variables about why that is the case, but one of them is, of course, defense, is being able to pay for a defense and get a defense attorney who genuinely, is trying to find justice. Yeah, that was a very sad and shameful statistic from 2020 that a lot of folks, I think, might be surprised by.
Yeah, shocking, not shocking, right? Well, actually, I was just about to ask you a question. Do you want to take it instead?
No, my question is, being that y'all both raised the question of the disproportionate number of people of color being locked up, I just don't want the audience to miss who they talking about when Trump talking about he's going to start doing stuff to homegrown people. Because at a certain point, When I'm saying, suppose I'm rehabilitated and other people are not. Last year we put on the ballot ending involuntary servitude, which is a different name for slavery. And in this liberal ass state, we failed. We pumped in hundreds of thousands of dollars and we failed. So like, everybody considering that, California is liberal, we could be, we could be freaky deaky, but we ain't really liberal.
Yeah. So California voters on the ballot last round decided to keep slavery in our state constitution. So, sort of supporting your points about the lack of progress that's being made and maybe even a lot of backsliding. And yes, in fact, President Trump has strongly alluded as he ramps up the crimmigration system and, sending people into, prisons that are not necessarily worse than many of our own prisons. That's one of the things as I look at some of the footage from El Salvador, which is horrifying. I also know, as a person who has been behind the walls of a lot of prisons and jails and has read many firsthand narratives, that we have equally horrifying prisons right within our own borders. Dorsey, my question to you is that for so many people in the movement against mass incarceration, you really embody the statement that personal is political. Like, you have lived it to a tremendous extent with just incredible stamina. I want you to share what you think are your most important lessons, let's say 3, on how to organize and to advocate and to be in community in the face of these systems, which have been with us for a long time, but certainly we are in a frightening moment nationally as we look at what's being imposed on, on people from all over the world by the United States, and what is continuing to be imposed on our own people. But what are the 3 things, perhaps? The lessons, they're all in this book, but there are so many lessons in this book that I can't recite them all.
Like one of the lessons is that I went to prison in 1972. I started learning how to read in about 1972 and 73. The people who were teaching me how to read was Black Panther Party members, Black Liberation Army members, and the BGF. And in order to acquire my education, I had to make a promise. The promise that I had to make was to return to the community an asset instead of a liability. If I had to give anything to anybody that's coming out of prison, I can tell them anger is not going to sustain you. Love is actually going to sustain you. So that's just lesson number 1. So if I've been struggling on this thing since the 70s, I stopped being angry a long time ago. Maybe disappointed, maybe refusing to actually give leeway for other people's feelings, and sometimes, that's a side effect is people hate you when you actually express certain truths or what appears to be true for you. The other thing that living in community is if I'm in community, I should be able to speak a full-throated truth to you, and you should be able to do that with me. And in relationship to incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people, at every stop that I've ever had by the police, they said you have the right to remain silent. What my damn job is to tell them they have the right to be as noisy as shit and people are violating their rights. So at a certain point, when do you stop being silent? And that was lesson, and in the effort is we need to speak in our own voice. That was something that was there. And when you said I founded All of Us are None, I didn't necessarily write. The foundation of All of Us are None is a document that I penned. And the document wasn't named All of Us are None. the document was named Save Ourselves, because I didn't necessarily depend on anybody else to actually do that. The other thing that I think that is there to be in the community is to recognize a certain thing that I didn't have real firm opportunity to recognize when I was in prison, because like from 19 to 31, I was in all male prisons. So I didn't have any real access to actually measure what the depth of oppression is for women. So like the whole drug war could have opened up a whole can of worms that was unavailable to the punishment of women prior to that. You know, so it's like the numbers dramatically increased. And also, it's like I went to prison for a serious crime, and people in my community was holding my sister more responsible for not taking care of her kids. You know, so I had a whole bunch of questions. But like the thing that I just really want to give, to the most part, is feeling shit. That slavery thing, it still goes through. Because my homies were locked up for decades for reading the wrong books. If you ever seen them search a cell block, the majority of stuff that I was seeing them discard when the guards came to throw it away were our books. You know, and that was the very substantive thing that we needed in order to change our lives. So like, I probably would suggest that people actually start investing in actually embracing people before they come home. Because I don't think that crime is driven by opportunity. I think it's driven by desperation. So like, so it's at a certain point, so I just started investing in stuff like refurbishing the historical black sites so they can have transition living. I'm also the co-founder of Free at Last, which is a drug reentry program, and I also campaigned on Proposition 36 that mandated treatment as opposed to incarceration. So my whole existence has been political, but at the first part of it is that I didn't know how, and actually, the last 3 years of being an executive director, I actually instilled in legal services for prisons with children a policy fellowship. So it's not like, we need to speak in our own voice. People need to be taught how to speak and not be afraid to do that.
Thank you. Those are really valuable lessons. All of a sudden that actually comes from a Bertolt Brecht lyric, which I did not know and which I learned in this incredible book. So thank you for that. We're close to the end of our time, and I want to make sure we have some time for your questions as well. So this is a question I'd like to hear from each of you on. So all three of the books deal, not only with state violence, but also with the most serious interpersonal violence. And if we're going to free ourselves from these carceral systems, if we're going to create a world in which we're not reliant on state violence to impose something that is some strange approximation of order or justice, what do we need to do? And I wondered, given you're specifically focused on the death penalty, at least in this book, what your point of view on that is. First, what do we need to do to contend with violence in a way that is different?
Just as an outsider, journalist who has visited a lot of prisons in and outside the U.S., when you walk through these prisons, for the most part, folks who I interview on the state side, who are being honest with me, admit to perpetrating violence, whether it's verbal or physical, against incarcerated folks. And the incarcerated folks have told me that, the same. that culture is very hard to change, but I just want to share one story of a female CO who I interviewed who worked on death row in Nevada. Her husband had worked there as well. She was following his lead. She was using violence and treating people with disrespect. And then she started going home and she started abusing her kids. And she didn't see the connection. And she went years doing that. And then she went through a separation, kind of big change in her life. And she started to decide, I'm unhappy like this. I'm a bad person. I'm going to start treating the incarcerated folks with respect. I'm going to stop being violent. And she did. And without even realizing it, she stopped abusing her kids. And there are some of these sort of ripple effects that, I think folks may not kind of think about. But yeah, I think culture is the hardest thing to change in some of these prisons. I think, our governor isn't perfect. I think he's trying to do the right thing. And he says in the name of public safety, I think he also cares about humanity. But, Emile, I'm interested to read your book, just particularly what you were saying about the programs. Because I think Newsom should read your book too, because that's not the answer, or the end, the final answer. But I do think, when you start to just treat folks with respect and start to change the culture in some of these incarceration facilities, San Quentin looks very different than the prisons that I visited in Texas and Florida and Nevada. And while it may not be perfect, it is way better than those places. Just seeing people on either side of the line treating each other with respect, playing basketball games together, having conversations, asking about each other's families, that doesn't happen in a lot of states. And again, while it's not perfect and I don't understand it probably on the level that you do, I think that changing culture from the ground up and leadership understanding how we have to change culture is probably a step in the right direction.
All right, thanks. Emile, what needs to change? You delve into this in your book.
I delve a lot.
So this is a hard one to encapsulate in a quick book.
Hashtag the imagination problem. But rather than getting into you would need context to for me to talk about the imagination problem. We don't have time for that. I would agree that fundamentally, just on a high level point of view, there needs to be shifts in ideology and culture. But on a practical level, it's first steps is we have to engage our dependence on police and our dependence on prison. Last year, my girlfriend, they were attacked, near their house, by 3 young black men, and brutally assaulted. And they're sitting there on the ground after that, and they're fuck, what I do? They have my keys, they have my wallet with my address, and what do I do? And this is an abolitionist I'm talking about. And eventually, they called the police and filed a report. And struggle with that decision. What does that mean? That now I've called the police and these 3 black men could very well just be killed. They're children, right? And it's this example of the crux of the problem. We don't have other options, right? And the police and prisons and the unions do a really good job of making sure we never get off the starting block and forming other options, right? But we have a dependence on police. And when I sit in lots of community conversations, I often hear that expressed in the terms of, oh, well, we need the police. What will we do when someone commits harm? And it's we don't need the police. We're dependent on them. It's a very different thing, right? If you were looking at an abusive spouse abusing his wife, we would never say of that wife, even if we could eat and she wouldn't leave because she has no options, she's got children, she has no job, she has nowhere else to go. We wouldn't look at that situation and be oh, well, she needs that abusive spouse. No, we would be wait, okay, I understand why she can't leave right now, and so now my focus, my job is how do we build a bridge to the place where she's at to a place where she can leave, right? And that's how you deal with dependence, right? We all recognize that's how you deal with dependence. And so first step is like being more accountable to that reality rather than this delusion that we need the police, and also start protecting the people doing the work to create those alternatives. Because like when the brother here tries to end slave labor in prison, right, like he's not getting enough support from the people who aren't holding their senators and their representatives accountable to like what a just world is, right? Instead, they're just listening to the prison unions and the police unions and who have big lobbies and are paying big money, and so are creating this place where representation is basically a function of wealth, and then things aren't happening, and then the senators tell you, oh, well, it's not safe, or we can't afford it, or there's nothing else to do. Like, in the book, like, I crunched the numbers, right? The money we spend on police and prisons, like, could literally solve homelessness, could forgive all college debt, could pay college for everybody, could, like, be universal. Like we could solve, like, the 3 biggest problems in our state and in our country if we just spent our money on something else, right? So like, that's step one. And I'll end this right there.
More. Thank you. Oh yeah, Dorsey, we want to take a question or two, so please let me know.
All right. I went outside of the United States because I am a real abolitionist. I've been to Paulsmore Prison in South Africa. I've been to Mariana Prison in El Salvador, Mount Eden Prison in New Zealand. Probably jumped around all through the Caribbean. I went down and interviewed Asada Shakur because I had a question about what do we do about domestic violence. You know, because I don't necessarily believe in calling the police. So what are my options? So like I think that people need to, not be so arrogant that they think that the only solution to problems is the solutions that the United States can think of. We need to shop a little bit further out because we could be if we hold 25% of the world population of prisoners, we could be some guilty people with bloody hands. And we might look to some other sources. So like, that's what I encourage people to do, is don't really just take a real narrow version of a truth. Maybe there's a larger truth that need to be considered. So that's what I just want to tell you is that, it ain't like I just sit here and when we fought slavery, the reason that I was sort of frustrated, that formerly incarcerated people in themselves, we spent $400,000 and raised the money in 3 months. That's what we dropped on this shit. So we thought that we had a winner because the question was body autonomy, and that was the issue that y'all were voting on last November. Y'all didn't care about my bodily autonomy. So anyway.
Look broader. I like that broader question. Okay, we got time for one question. Okay, we got time for one question, so please make it good. I could talk with the 3 of you all day about this, but I know that we have lots of other folks who need your time and attention as well. And we've got a winner right here. Hold on, here comes the mic.
I wanted to hear about the titles of everyone's book. I'm moved by the title Ghost in the Criminal Justice Machine. I'm moved by the title What Kind of Bird Can't Fly? And I'm also curious about the title The Volunteer. Could you start, Emile, talking about the ghost in the criminal justice machine?
Yeah, I mean, that title has a lot for me. Like, I'm into poetry, so like it has, allusions, ghost in the machine, ghost in the shell, ghost in the machine, the philosophical kind of like philosophy. But without digging into all of that, like for me, it's like it has this double meaning. It's like ghost in the machine, and that's talking about like me and incarcerated people who are invisible in prison and who enjoy a power dynamic with the state that is so disparate that the state does not have to hide from us what it's doing. Like we see the clearest rollings and mechanisms of this country operating through the prisons. Like, I don't think anyone can understand this country better than an incarcerated person. And so, and with that, there is power in that, especially for the right minds, right? Like I have the kind of mind that sees patterns and I'm a strategist, so that was great for me. Not prison, but being able to see that. And then the other side of that coin, the ghost, is also like white supremacy in all of our institutions and in us that we don't see, and the way it operates, and the way that it continues to create hegemony, and the way that it continues to create an imagination problem, and the way that it continues to take every initiative, every principle, every theory of change we have, corrupt it, turn it into a near enemy of that thing that looks like it but actually undermines it. So that's the other side of the ghost, and we can nerd out about anime and movies later.
I'm not as poetic as these two. The Volunteer is about a man who volunteered for execution, and I could go into the subheader, but it's probably more interesting to hear from Dorsey before we're up.
What kind of bird can't fly?
Jailbird.
I think I contend that all birds can fly. Shit, a penguin didn't walk here. An ostrich didn't walk here. They could get on United Airlines and come. You know what I'm saying? So all of us at this point should determine that all birds can fly. And that's what I was trying to challenge, was the notion. Because at a certain point, when I stopped being the executive director of legal services for prisons with children, there was a reason that I retired. The reason I retired is because I became more conservative in my approaches about what I was saying. Because there was 31 people depending upon my leadership. So at a certain point, I had a $3 million operation or $4 million operation every year. The next person that we picked to be the next director was 31 years old. He was much more aggressive. Y'all have to deal with Paul. So it's like the book, and by the way, the first book, the first title, that was the second title. That was the marketing title. When I was writing the book, what I was writing was, I want to name it Battered but Unbroken.
Beautiful. Thank you all